We've all got a card or a handful of cards that make us happy and somehow manage to wrangle their way into far more decks than one would expect just because we want to play with them more. And this is a very normal human impulse, an impulse that I share. Skullstorm, Shigeki, Mask of Memory, and the Mages are all cards that I have lurking in the back of my mind, begging me to put them into a deck. But should that voice be listened to? Should these pet cards be slammed in as many decks as possible? The answer to that is not a clean yes or no, and it depends on a couple factors. First of all, I should define here what I mean by pet card. This is generally thought of as cards that players have some sort of fondness toward, but pet cards can be pet cards for a variety of different reasons. Players might enjoy the art or flavor, they might find the card's effect cool and unique, and they also might just really enjoy what the card has to offer for their deck. For starters, I want to address the pet cards that are either generally bad or so hyper-specific that it's difficult to find a deck where they truly feel at home. One good option for these is to build a deck with the understanding that it's here to fulfill the most primal of pet card desires. If it's a card you like for aesthetics, build a deck that fits that aesthetic. If it's a card you like for its effect, find cards that go with it in some way and make that the broader thing. The deck likely won't be great, but that's fine because it's not here to be great. I doubt any of this is controversial, but I figure I should express it anyway since this category of cards often does make up a non-zero portion of the cards that people consider their pet cards. On the opposite end of the spectrum, there are the pet cards that are just good, or at least they're flexible enough never to feel bad. I poked around a bit in forums and saw a handful of answers like Dawn Charm, Swansong, and Campbell, Consul of Allocation. And yeah, these cards are just good, and you can put them in a deck of their colors and they will be almost guaranteed to feel at least decent in a casual EDH game. I mentioned Shigeki earlier, and I'd like to put that card in this category as well. I run it in two different ramp-heavy green decks, and having a flexible recursion ability that's uncounterable and at instant speed is good enough that the card never feels dead. Is that just cope on my part? That's up to you to decide. With that, we've knocked out the cases of cards that aren't very good and cards that are strong and or flexible enough to feel good in most games. That leaves us with the stuff in the middle. What does one do with a moderately potent card with a somewhat specific use case? Well, there are two options for this. Option A is you take one or two pet cards and build a specific deck for them. Too often I've seen people keep cards in their deck that are ill-fitting just because they like them. And while I'm not trying to shame anybody for playing what they like, I think it's useful to keep in mind that you're not just doing your deck a disservice, you're also doing that pet card a disservice. You can throw these sorts of cards into any old deck whose color identity they fit, but this doesn't necessarily mean they'll feel satisfying. These sorts of cards won't reach their full potential if you're playing them in a deck they only tangentially connect to, and at the worst, you might gradually grow resentment for them if you keep drawing them rather than a card that is more useful. Meanwhile, the act of building a deck that a pet card fully belongs in is the greatest act of love you can show your favorite piece of cardboard, and it can also be quite fun to build around a card that you love. I've done this for Astral Slide, Maze's End, and Time Sieve, and in all three cases it led to a deck that is a blast to play, in which I actively enjoy the process of tuning. Some decks built this way will be stronger than others due to the potential power of the card in question. The Time Sieve deck is definitely the strongest of those last three, but the principle still stands. Figuring out how to best express a card, either in terms of power level or in terms of vibe, is a lot of fun. The other option for utilizing niche, moderately powerful pet cards is to put a bunch in one deck, basically to figure out a deck that is well equipped to handle a number of different types of effect. The Astral Slide and Maze's End decks I built, along with my Maria Voltron deck, are all too focused to throw other random pet cards into without incurring significant losses to deck quality. But there are other types of deck that are much more flexible in what sorts of card they can accommodate. One of these is mid-range decks with simple goals and a solid core. My Rata deck is running all sorts of fun cards I enjoy, and it's able to do this because the types of card the deck is looking for are 6 to 7 drops with some sort of meaningful game impact, and 4-cost cards that vaguely gesture at the concept of ramp. The deck is also built on a budget and limited to being mid-power by its nature, so it can accommodate a lot of cards that are too weak for a higher power deck. My friend Hans has a Jensen Carthalion deck that's basically just 5-color beatdown, and the cards that make the cut for what the deck is looking for is basically anything that lets it hit people with angel tokens more vigorously. If you want a pithy rule of thumb, the more generic a deck's general game plan is, the more niche and varied the specific card choices can be. In addition to generic midrange decks, there are also specific themes that lend themselves to running more niche cards. One of these is Proliferate, a mechanic I built at a low power level with a commander that I love dearly, Skeleton Ship. It contains a lot of juicy cards I like, such as Overwhelming Intellect, Mind Unbound, a couple Parallax enchantments, Grimoire of the Dead, and several questionable storage lands, among others. None of these cards are irredeemably bad, but they're weird and niche enough that I was struggling to find a home for them elsewhere. With the generic template of a Precon Power Proliferate control deck, though, I can pack a ton of these cards and have them all feel appropriate and all get their chance to shine. This can also be scaled up in power level. For a stronger Proliferate deck, you could run Atraxa, and with that, there are all sorts of options. Planeswalkers are one of the more popular ones, but a friend of mine built Atraxa as a ramp deck with a bunch of Myojins, which ended up pretty entertaining. Some other themes that are pretty flexible and often overlapping are tokens, graveyard stuff, and synergies with a specific card type, such as artifacts or enchantments. The key here is that you need to figure out a solid core to the deck. You should make sure it has a way to get off the ground, usually by having enough lands, ramp, and draw, and then you can start to sprinkle in your spicier stuff and add support where needed for different types of cards. It's also good to make sure you don't forget to run interaction. Protection for vulnerable elements of the deck, and removal to make sure that opponents don't run away with the game, are important aspects in most decks, and they're too often forgotten in pursuit of a fun vision. It may be tempting to disregard these, but if you're making a funny deck, how well-rounded it is may determine whether it ends up being a deck you want to keep playing with, or whether it ends up getting set aside as that gimmick deck that was fun for a little while. To reiterate a couple key points, pet cards are a fundamental part of the social fabric in just about any collectible card game that exists, and it's obviously silly to suggest that adding them to decks is flatly wrong. At the same time, exercising a bit of discretion in where these cards are played can lead to them being more enjoyable. For those decent but somewhat niche pet cards out there, there are two options for fitting them into decks: building a deck around a single card, or building a deck that's general enough to fit a number of these specific cards in them. A deck that's already focused and gunning to complete a specific task probably isn't a great spot for pet cards that are only tangentially related to what the deck is doing, but a more general deck can be a great place to add in some funkier choices. As a final note, the fact that some cards don't go well in some decks is also why I'm such a big proponent of budget deck building. I could throw $500 at a fancy deck, but for that same amount, I could build a half dozen decks at lower budget points that can all serve the interests of different gameplay styles and different cards I love. When I'm building decks on a higher budget, I need to think harder about how well a deck will work and how much I'll actually enjoy it in the long term. But if I'm throwing together a $50 list based on a card I really like or a funny premise, I can just order that sucker with no second thoughts, knowing that if I get half a dozen fun games out of it, I'll be happy. And to me, that's pretty cool. Thanks for watching. If you got some pet cards you really like, you can let me know in the comments. Both because I like hearing about fun cards people like, and also because it serves my algorithmic overlords. That's a win-win if I ever heard one.